Good morning, everybody. The Reverend Dr. Stephen Newcomb is the founding director of the Kaleo Center for Faith, Justice, and Social Transformation. It's affiliated with United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities in St. Paul. If you go to the Kaleo Center website, you will find this statement. If justice is your calling, Kaleo is calling you. I had the great pleasure of taking a course at the Kaleo Center a couple of years ago called Encore Career, which facilitates a process of discernment for people transitioning into retirement and discovering how to make a difference in retirement in a personally meaningful way. Steve Newcomb was one of the primary instructors, and he, in my judgment, is a person with deep insight. I highly recommend the Encore Career Course at the Kaleo Center for anybody interested, based on my own personal experience. So it is indeed with great pleasure that I introduce and welcome the Reverend Dr. Steve Newcomb. Steve, you're on.
Hi, Tom. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that kind introduction, and it's great to see you again. Our paths have not crossed a lot since class ended, so it's great to see you. I'm going to start with a little introduction, and as John said, I'm going to present a framework, sort of a tool, and then after that, we're going to spend some time working with the tool together and applying it in current context. So let me start. A little background about my own personal journey to faith-grounded social transformation. I moved to United in the late 70s to attend United Theological Seminary, where Kaleo is currently housed. I spent my last semester at Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C. that brings together seminary students from across the country to focus on the intersection of theology and public policy. And because Wesley is in DC, that gives it access to all of the sort of expressions of government and the expressions of denominations doing public policy work and attempting to impact public policy. And that was a sort of a seminal experience and clarified for me that my ministry would be housed and located at this intersection of faith and public life, theology and public policy. And part of my experience in that program at Wesley was a sense that church folks understood the theology side of that equation a little better than the public policy side. And so when I finished my seminary education, I missed a part in here. I went to the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs to sort of understand more fully how the public policy process works. After that, I worked for the Greater Minneapolis Council of Churches for 7 years, coordinating a set of services to help seniors stay in their own homes. One of those programs was the Metro Paint-a-thon that Plymouth was an active participant in. So we have that sort of history. And then I went to work as executive director for the Headwaters Foundation for Justice, whose sort of mantra that it operated under was change, not charity. And the focus of its work was supporting grassroots organizations to identify issues within their own community and that was impacting them and identify and create solutions. And our work was to help support and fund that. We supported a wide array of issues, but the focus was always around what are the strategies for change the groups are using? What is the impact they're having in the world? What is the outcomes that they're looking for? And what strategies are going to help get them there? I was at Headwaters for 18 years. While I was there, I became increasingly frustrated by how loud the religious right had become and how silent it seemed that progressive faith traditions were, and were unable to sort of find the language and the methodologies to have a significant, or as significant as I would hope, impact in the world. So I received a Bush Foundation Leadership Fellowship that I use to research theological education, and in particular, justice education within theological contexts. And there was a number of findings from that research. One of which, that social justice resides on the margins within theological education, and while it is present in courses across all the disciplines, it has no discipline of itself. And of all the seminaries in the United States, only about 5% provide specialized degrees or concentrations in social justice or social transformation, which when compared to pastoral care or family ministries, et cetera, those represent literally 50% of seminaries to offer specialized degrees and education in those areas. One of the other findings was that justice education in theological context is primarily issue and ism education. We teach students about social justice issues, poverty and war and homelessness and trafficking and a whole array of issues, and a set of isms as well, sexism and racism, et cetera. And this is important and critical information and education, but it is focused on the injustice, not the doing of justice. So I call that injustice education. It's critical, it's valuable, it's necessary, but while it instills a sense of ought, it doesn't actually equip faith leaders with the how-to of doing justice. In the research, I was unable to find any sort of identification of core competencies for doing social justice, social transformation work, and a lack of conceptual frameworks to guide strategic action. Kaleo was launched with that concern in mind, and one of our core goals is to advance a framework for faith leaders to understand and be effective in their work in community and their work for social justice. So part of the attempt that this framework that I'm going to share with you in a minute is around shifting from just having a set of concerns about social issues to what is the strategic action that we can take to make a difference. How do we understand and frame our justice work? How do we know what's really going on in the world and where our leadership and our action is needed? What do we need to know and know how to do? How do we decide what actions will be effective in this particular context, in this particular circumstance? What strategies will produce the desired results? And how do we layer these strategies so that we build on the impact that we're having? And how do we align our work in ways that it is directed towards the central promise that we're serving or the concern we're attempting to address? And how do we shift from just having and holding these concerns to having a framework for guiding strategic action? I call the framework that I'm going to share today SEVENFOLD. And it is grounded in the sense that there are multiple dimensions of social transformation. And if we're going to create social change and social transformation that's permanent, then I believe we need to integrate all 7 of these social change strategies. If we're going to change the world, we're going to have to transform worldviews. Grounded in our deepest spiritual values, we need to unmask the dominant narrative and write a new future of beloved community. We have to envision a new shared future where we need to envision our own place within it. What unique contributions can we make to the movements for justice? Where are we most strategically needed? How is our solidarity best expressed? We need to amplify the voices that are speaking for justice, to use the power we have with and to follow and to support those who cannot breathe. Too much is at stake for us not to act powerfully. We have to forge just and inclusive systems to give life and give expression to our core values and our commitments. And we have to form ourselves for public faith. What do we need to know and know how to do in the repair of the world? What ignites our soul and grounds our action? From what encounter does our longing for justice come? what roots our action in the world. All of this around the central promise or mission that we serve. And it is this promise that gives legitimacy to all of those actions and holds all those actions in alignment and in accountability. Viewed individually, each one of these dimensions represents an independent strategy, each with its own focus, each has its own theory of change about what change is needed to create the outcomes that we're looking for. Each one of these dimensions requires a distinct set of strategies and methodologies. The work of harnessing power and organizing is decidedly different than the work of forming persons in education. And that knowing what the competencies, the methodologies, the intended impact of each of these strategies is an important component. And these are not narrow. There is no just one way to proclaim, or not just one way to organize, or not just one way to educate, but represents a category of action that has an intended outcome. Taken together, these autonomous strategies, which often reside and operate on their own, now become integrated tactics within a larger and more comprehensive transformation strategy. And what I'm hoping this does is reframes an infinite set of social justice issues into 6 strategic dimensions for action, which then can be applied to whatever issue you're concerned about, whatever context that you find yourself in. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now looking at each one of these elements and see how they contribute to our overall transformation efforts, and how they exist and complement and align with one another. Transforming worldviews for beloved community. It's the act of proclamation. Proclamation situates our actions within the significance, legitimacy, and meaning of our deepest values and histories, relationships, and shared aspirations. It unmasks and challenges the dominant worldview, which legitimates the status quo. It frames and names the why of our action. And I'm going to use an example of the marriage amendment. I know Plymouth was actively involved in this, and I'm going to use it as an example across all of these various strategies. One of the things that happened in the marriage amendment campaign in Minnesota is that the basic framing around the messaging for the amendment shifted from all the other campaigns that had existed around marriage amendment struggles in multiple other states. And there had been a number of other states that had passed constitutional amendments stating that marriage could only be between a man and a woman. And they had continued to succeed until they hit Minnesota. And that was the first time it failed, and there has been no passage since then. And one of the core pieces, I believe, that happened when this issue came up in Minnesota is that the old frame about the worldview, the messaging historically had been that marriage is a right and that gay people have the same rights as other people to be married. In Minnesota, that messaging changed, and the message became marriage is about love, and that folks who are in love ought to have an opportunity to express that and have a structure that holds them in their love the same way that love is held between a man and a woman. I believe that was one of the fundamental shifts that occurred, and why the campaign was successful here and successful moving forward. And this represents a particular type of change. It's a change in worldview. Catalyzing movements for cultural change is about envisioning a new future. We anticipate and catalyze collective action towards the world that we seek. Envisioning taps our prophetic imagination, calling forth new action and new possibilities. Building movements requires also that we understand our particular place within the ecosystem of justice. How can we best contribute our unique skills, our unique position in the world to join with others in building this larger movement? And that happened during the marriage amendment. a multi-faith table was convened where folks gathered and shared their strategies, compared notes, shared successes and failures, and learned from one another. And while we all worked within our own denominational traditions, we were merging all of those together into a larger movement. And it was the most exciting and the most diverse multi-faith table I've ever sat at. In addition to the usual suspects of UCC and Presbyterian and Lutheran and Methodist, etc., we also had Buddhists and Mormons and Wiccans, a very wide cross-section, and that represents the way that movements are built. Folks from different contexts with specific visions align in agreement around a larger vision and move that forward together. So movements are about streams of actions coming together to create a bigger flow. And the type of change that movement building contributes is cultural change. So when the marriage amendment was won here in Minnesota, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, it was a legislative victory. And then that was followed by another legislative victory that made it legal for homosexual marriage in Minnesota. And it was a cultural change because to a large extent, that conversation is done. It has been accepted that we support gay marriage. And it's less of a conversation, unlike abortion or other issues that have not had a cultural resolution. Harnessing power. Organizing energizes commitment and passion for sustained and powerful action. Organizing amplifies the voices that have been silenced and empowers collective engagement and impact. The marriage amendment was organized around powerful one-to-one conversations of individuals talking to other folks about what love meant for them, or gay folks that they had in their lives. And this took it to a very powerful interpersonal place of conversations that moved this movement forward and made the difference about the decisions that were made. And the type of change that organizing produces is political, not partisan politics, but political in the sense of whose voice matters, whose voice is heard, and whose voices have been organized and harnessed to have an impact. Forging systems for a just and sustainable world requires advocacy. And advocacy addresses the systems and structures through which justice is expressed. Advocacy is about system change and advancing sustainable and just structures. The marriage amendment, again, as an example, defeated the constitutional amendment and then went on to legalize marriage within Minnesota. Those were structural changes. But as you see, those structural changes were connected with other strategies that made the whole movement successful. Advocacy was combined with organizing and movement building and reframing the core message. Advocacy is about changing the systems or the structures through which justice is expressed. Forming persons for public faith. Education is how we form persons, and it equips us with the knowledge, competencies, and confidence with which we act. Education provides what we need to know and know how to do. And education forms us and prepares us to live our deepest convictions for the healing of the world. The marriage amendment invested a ton of time in individual trainings, so folks knew how to do the one-to-ones with someone who had a different perspective, how to talk about love, how to talk about relationship, how to share your own personal story of how you came to understand that marriage is about love. And it represented a particular kind of change and was directed towards a particular kind of change, and that change was personal. Personal for the people who received the training, and personal change for the people that we were engaging in conversation. And the last dimension that I think that is required for social transformation is igniting souls through the strategy of encounter. Encounter connects us to the context and the relationships from which our action springs. Encounter, to use our more current language, gets us woke. Encounter grounds us in the historical, social, and ecological realities of the world in which we live. And the marriage amendment, the encounter, was the proposed constitutional amendment. That is what grabbed people's attention. That's what ignited this movement. And the type of change that encounter attempts to provide is soulful. It's deep within, that not only ignites in the moment, but continues to burn and provides the grounding and the motivation for our ongoing work. Taken together, these represent a whole that is much more powerful than the individual parts. And it also reframes our orientation for doing racial or social justice or any kinds of justice. And that this framework not only has 7 dimensions, but there are dynamics embedded within the framework and the structure as well. It multiplies the impacts that we can have in the world. So rather than only focusing on education or only focusing on art organizing, by integrating and layering these strategies, we can multiply the kind of impact and the depth of the change that we're attempting to create. Each one of these dimensions provides a lens of understanding. It illuminates a particular set of actions. So if you look through the transforming worldviews dimension, you can see the ways in which does our message hold up a worldview that calls people into it? Does our proclamation adequately name the dominant narrative and where it is flawed? Does it illuminate what could be said, what could be messaged, what worldviews could be shaped? And while it illuminates that, it obscures all the other components that are needed within an overall sense of transformation. So the methodology is to deliberately utilize each one of these dimensions as a lens for deepening your understanding of a given issue. What is the worldview that is keeping this in place that needs to be changed? What is the movement that exists? What is the ecosystem like, and where can we plug into that? Who's doing the organizing, and where is power, and where does it need to be realigned? And what's wrong with the systems? Where are they defective and not working for us? And how well are we forming persons for public faith and public engagement? And how well are we helping folks stay in tune with the encounters that they've had, introduce them to new encounters that ignite their souls in new ways? So each of these provides a lens that helps us understand more significantly the given issue. And taken together, they provide a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on. Each lens is important, but each one is necessary, but none are sufficient on their own. Each of these dimensions also represents a realm of action. There's an array of actions that can take place within igniting souls or forging systems or catalyzing movements. And the framework allows us to think strategically about what are the strategies we're using in each of these dimensions of life and each one of these dimensions of action, because if we leave any dimension out, we will not achieve the transformation that we're hoping for. Whatever it is we're attempting to achieve, if we don't have the power to get us there, it's not going to happen. If we don't have the necessary skills and know-how, we're not going to get there. If we can't change the systems, we're not going to sustain the change. If we don't alter worldviews, we're going to keep repeating the same narratives. So they represent not only lenses of understanding and illumination, but also realms and avenues for action. Another component of this is how you strategically align the components. And this means starting in the middle with the promise that you serve and moving to proclamation, and then working your way around the rest of the wheel or the circle clockwise. Naming the promise you serve, being clear about why it matters and what's at stake, How do you arrange and organize a movement in service for this promise? What power is needed? What relationships do you have that you can utilize? What relationships do you need to create to serve this promise? What systems can be aligned to harness, to utilize the to utilize the power that you have harnessed? What are the skills that people need to know to achieve the particular promise that you're serving? And how do you bring more people into this movement? How do they encounter the importance of this? And how do we align all these strategies so that they are in service to the promise that sits at the center? This is also scalable. You can apply this framework personally. You can apply it to an organization. You can apply it to an institution, a community, a department. It scales because all of these components of worldview and movements and power and systems and resources exist at every scale of our lives. They also represent places where we are probably more or less comfortable. We may be more familiar with particularly strategies and we're comfortable operating there. It's a natural place for us. And that's a good thing at one level. This means that as you're doing work within your congregation or community, that there are multiple places and ways for people to plug in. Some folks might have skills related to education, but not understand or know how to do organizing. Some folks love and live to organize, but don't do advocacy work. This provides avenues for everyone's action and ways for everyone to contribute. But it also comes with a downside in that we may be particularly comfortable in one frame and then never move out of that. And one of the natural tendencies of all of us is to do what we know how to do. And so we do it over and over again, hoping that this is going to produce the result. But it could be that what we know how to do is educate, and we educate and we educate and we educate, but we don't help people know how to harness power or to forge systems. And so that we don't move it past just one frame and have an impact in others. So in some ways, it's opportunity and an open framework that people can plug in multiple ways. But it also carries a particular critique that says you can't just live in one dimension. You have to think holistically about your work in places that you might need to be called to have the impact that you want to have in the world. And if we look at most congregations, I would argue that they're the strongest around proclamation, encounter, and educate. That this is work that congregations and churches have done for a long time and know how to do it and do it well, are often, however, less comfortable doing advocacy or organizing or movement building. And these represent new dimensions that I think congregations can live into in service to the promise, in service to the justice in a broader world. And then I want to just articulate one last dynamic about the frame, and that is because of the circle moves clockwise, there's a hierarchy to that the worldview determines the movements that we create, and the movements that we're trying to create determine what kind of power is needed and what kind of relationships we have. And that determines what sort of systems we need to have in place to move it, which informs what people need to know and know how to do, et cetera. And that this hierarchy can be useful in the sense that we often identify an issue. We're in the midst of a organizational or justice work, and it feels like somehow the systems aren't working, or we don't have enough power, or we're conflicted internally about the power dynamics. And oftentimes what will happen is we will go down a dimension to solve it when in fact we need to go up one. Issues of power are very rarely resolved by restructuring, by changing the systems. Issues of power are resolved and utilized through mission, through the direction that you're trying to move things. And so the maxim sort of goes, whatever you think the issue is, go up one to find the solution and avoid going down one. So that represents the framework in its entirety. I'd like to pause just for a second. We're going to now, in a moment, we're going to shift and we're going to look at this framework in relationship to the issues of racial justice that are increasingly being revealed in our world. But I guess I would like to invite folks now, if they have any clarifying questions that I could answer at this point, I would invite folks to type in the chat. And I'll return over there so I can see. Tom or John, are you there? And are you seeing any questions in the chat?
No questions yet, Steve.
All right. Well, I'm just going to assume that that was brilliantly clear. And I'm going to move this forward a little bit. And so now I want you to hold this framework, to think about these sort of components in your mind. And then let's look together about what that means in the context of racial injustice that we have currently been experiencing and aware of. Here's a picture of the memorial for George Floyd's murder and death. And I want to use this as a window into this dynamic of sevenfold change. And so I'd invite you to chat away here with us, and I'm going to ask some questions. I'm interested in your responses. What were the immediate responses to this? What did you see? What occurred in our world in light of this? And I want us to think about it in terms of the frame. This was the encounter, right? In slow motion horror, we watched George Floyd die. And we had to ask ourselves, is this really us? Today, still? And the answer to all three was undeniable, yes. What did that do to us? And what action did that then call forth from us? One of the pieces that happened was an explosion of resources. People want to read books. Books are coming out. Seeing White, Just Mercy, How to Be an Anti-Racist, 12 Years a Slave, White Fragility, Dear Church, Dear White Christian. People were reaching for knowledge and context to understand what's going on, and they moved. And in some ways, this represents the sort of developmental flow of social transformation, that it begins often with an encounter, which rocks us on our heels and calls us to action in oftentimes ways we don't know how to respond. And so we look for more knowledge. We look to deepen our understanding of what's going on. And so we move from encounter to educate. And then from educate, we move to structure. And we look for structural change. And we look to forge systems through advocacy. And we've seen a number of structural elements been sort of raised up as solutions to the issue of police brutality and racial injustice. And so there's movements to defund the police and end chokeholds or find new tools within the system of policing. Kamala Harris was elected the first African Asian American woman of color as vice president. That is a significant structural change. We have representations within the system that we have never had before. We have voter registration and the work Stacey Abrams did in Georgia that literally turned an election around. And the structures of ranked choice voting, for example, all represent ways to shift the system to be more responsive to the concerns and address issues of injustice. And one of the things that happened is people exploded into the streets. According to the New York Times, the protests following the death of George Floyd were the largest in US history, included 2,000 US cities and towns, and 60 countries around the world participated. Centering of Black Lives Matter and the call across the nation for systems and structures for change was grounded in this huge outcry. And multiple streams are coming together to catalyze the movement. Racial Justice Network, Showing Up for Racial Justice Minnesota, Reclaim the Block, Black Visions Collective, Facing Race, are all organizations and movements that have been doing work literally for years, preparing the groundwork, whose now work is coming together in ways that is addressing and informing a movement. And people are proclaiming new worldviews. Churches, for example, Westwood Lutheran Church issued a statement that says, "We see racism as one of the most urgent issues throughout history and today, and acknowledge that they operate, and we all do, within and benefit from a system of privilege and have knowingly and unwittingly participated in marginalization." And on this issue, repentance is one of the first steps that's required to move forward in justice. Even corporations are making statements and proclaiming alternative worldviews and thinking and naming how they're going to change their work in the world. We commit to sustained engagement, leading conversations on hiring, voting, donating, advocacy, and partnership. These are all strategies around that circle, insisting on diverse and minority voices. Our commitment will necessarily change how we approach our work in ways that are aligned with equity. So they are reconfiguring their organization around this new promise that they feel called to serve. And I feel like I have talked longer than I want. So I would like to just open it up now for questions, answers, and conversation.
Steve, we have a comment from
Great.
Angelo in the comments in the chat section. It seems to me that Christianity needed both Jesus and Paul for Christianity to meet all parts of the change model.
So Anne, are you suggesting, and I'm going to ask you to maybe say a little more, were there pieces of this that you thought sort of Jesus emphasized and pieces that you think Paul emphasized?
Sorry. Now
Yeah,
can you hear me?
we can.
Sorry,
Oh.
I need to allow you to talk, Ann. Sorry about that.
Okay. I don't have the model in front of me. That would help me. Could
I sure
somebody
can.
put the model back?
Yeah,
Because I was trying to think this through.
yeah.
And before you started talking about George Perry Floyd, can you just have the visual,
Yeah.
the 6 things?
Let me stop that for a
Well,
second.
anyway,
Right.
it seemed to me that Jesus
help?
definitely, right now I'm not seeing anything. I'm not here either. I can't see my video.
I'll get you.
For some reason, I am unvideoed. Anyway, it seemed to me that Jesus definitely got something going, kind of like you said, thank you.
Is that it?
I think yes, he ignited souls. Jesus ignited souls. He had a transforming worldview. He was trying to educate his disciples. And if you believe the synoptic gospels, they often didn't get it. I'm not sure that that wasn't a way that the gospel writers tried to educate people instead of the disciples not getting it, but for whatever. And he definitely had a vision and kind of catalyzed movement. I'm not sure he had time to organize or he was particularly good at organizing, but definitely Peter and Paul organized small churches. and created a system that worked, and they continued to educate uh, the small churches in what it meant to be a Christian,
Yeah.
so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of needing to address all of the dimensions of the wheel, and that Jesus held up a worldview, and as you say, ignited people, and he did a little organizing. He at least got 12 disciples organized.
Yeah, that's true.
But that work needs a form, needs a structure. It needs sustaining power to continue to move forward. And I think that's a great example of how all of the dimensions of the wheel need to be engaged. Thank you for that observation, Anne. There was a question somebody asked about how this applies at a personal level as well as organization. And the same pieces are applicable at your own scale. What is your personal worldview? How do you view the world and the world that you want to move into? Where do you understand yourself in relationship to movements? Where do you plug in and contribute your individual skills, either within the life of Plymouth as the congregation that you plug in there, and that's the movement you're part of? Or you may choose that there are other avenues that make more sense for you personally. And what is your own personal power, and how do you use it in relationship to the promise that you're serving? And what forms and structures work best for you in your engagement with social change, which can help inform where you plug in and that sort of thing. And personally, where do you need to grow? What do you need to know and know how to do? And how do you do this work that you stay grounded in the drive that initiated this work, in a way that you remain accountable to that? Did that help answer that question? And I'm having difficulty seeing the chat when I'm sharing, so I'm going to turn sharing off. I am willing to make my slides available. I tried to post some links in the chat, and I was unable to do that. John, can you tell me, will we have at the end a list of everyone's email address?
Yes.
We will send out, I will send a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. I will send an overview of what Kaleo does, and then I have a larger one-page overview of this whole framework, a double-sided, that provides more detail and more explanation. So I will send that as well.
We have a couple of comments in places online, but we also have someone named Tom in our audience who has raised his hand. And Tom,
Yeah.
turned on your mic. So Tom, please go ahead.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Dr. Newcomb, for coming in. This is really interesting. I have to say that it is a pretty cerebral outline of a way to do things, which seems in this day and age to be something of a disadvantage. I wonder how we can move this down to a less cerebral, more modern way of presenting. And then as I make a list of, kind of race issues in the Twin Cities, educational achievement, policing, work disparities, housing disparities, medical care disparities, where do you see this method plugging in, at a high level or at a much lower level?
Both. And that's why it's useful in a scalable way. So at a high level, you just identified a number of systems where discrimination occurs and is expressed. Within each of those systems, all of these same components will be manifest as well. And so then that says, in that smaller system, you can look at what is the worldview and where is the movement towards the change that you're hoping for, and where can you plug in, and what power can you bring to that, and what power is needed. And so that each one of these can drill down and become increasingly specific as it's applied in that particular context. Did that make some sense?
Sure. Yep.
Great.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. There's one here from Jonathan. You say this works well on a personal level. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
I tried to. So I think I just tried to address that one. In terms of how we personally can to gauge each one of those elements, as well as doing that organizationally. There was a comment here I see about the promise in the marriage amendment was simple and concrete. Racial justice is much more general. It seems harder to organize around a goal, and it is. Racial equity is clearly more complex and ambiguous than defeating a constitutional amendment. But in some ways, the central promise around the marriage amendment was much bigger than just the amendment itself. It was around marriage equality. And even then, that was a clearer outcome than what racial equity looks like. We can point to and say we know what marriage looks like. It is much more difficult to point to and say this is what, particularly in a social context, this is what racial equity looks like. And so that means that the movement part that we're involved with means that we have to build that vision together. And it can't just be ours, it needs to be a collective vision. And then there's a set of skills that are needed to apply in that context. How do we create that together so that we don't perpetuate our engagement of it, doesn't perpetuate the white supremacy or privilege that we're trying to undo? How do we do this in such a way that voices that have not been heard and that need to be heard are part of that creation as we move forward?
Okay. Steve and all attendees, I apologize. We are running rapidly out of time. And so
Yes, we are.
to put an end to the conversation at this point, I'm sorry if we didn't get to everybody who raised their hand or put in a question. We did our best, and I'm sure Steve will be happy to follow up with you if we can make it possible for you to get in touch with him or vice versa. So we'll continue the conversation in another way.